and give you another look at flooding in parts of KZN, some analysis on the story. We're joined by Professor Kaitano Dube, who is an Associate Professor of Tourism Geography at Vaal University of Technology. Thanks very much indeed for your time, Prof. Thanks for joining us. And we've just heard from, climate change finance at the G20 and how important it is to invest in things like sustainable infrastructure, because ultimately it will prevent the kinds of tragedies we're seeing unfold yet again in KwaZulu-Natal.
Good afternoon, Michelle, and good afternoon to your viewers, and thank you for having me. So in terms of what we are seeing that is playing out, developing countries find themselves at the receiving end of the climate change backlash with increased loss and damage. And what we are also seeing is that there is failure, particularly by governments in these particularly developing countries, to finance the level of loss and damage that we are seeing that is taking place on the ground, which is actually a tragedy. But I would just want to say that perhaps if we look at it from a critical perspective, there's a lot that we would want maybe to use this finance for. First thing is to try and build infrastructure that is actually resilient. If you look at some of our infrastructure and some of the climate scenario that is playing out in most of our municipalities, we actually realize that we are lagging behind in terms of upgrading our infrastructure, particularly when it comes to floods. Infrastructure such as bridges, the culverts, and also the drainage system find itself not being capable of actually draining water if we have got large torrents of rainfall like the ones that we have seen over the past years. And this year, because it's naturally an a La Nina year, there is actually a lot of rainfall that has been received, but giving also the perspective that over the past couple of years, we have been receiving normal to above normal rainfall. It also means that our water tables are actually high. So any small amount of rainfall that you receive in areas that are low-lying, particularly in Durban, will actually result in flooding. So we need finances, yes, but what we also need is strong governance system that is able to actually take all these factors into consideration. But what we have been seeing over the past couple of years is the weakening of local governance systems, which have got serious implications in terms of our ability and also capacity to respond to climate change backlash. So if you look at the El Nino phenomena, which is actually a factor of climate variability, but what we are also seeing is that the nexus between climate change and climate variability is giving us a complex picture, which requires leaders that have got the capacity to understand, to plan. So finance is one aspect that we need, but the most critical thing that we need is good governance, good local governance, particularly at local level, because we're seeing a lot of these impacts playing it themselves out at local levels.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's say for a second, Professor Dube, that we've got good governance at local government level. Even with that in place, for us to get to a stage where we can say we've got stronger roads, we've got better power lines, we've got more resilient infrastructure on the whole, even then with good governance in place, if we were to start on that project now, it is years away from achieving. And of course, the lack of governance, proper governance measures, sets that back perhaps decades more.
Indeed. So governance plays a critical role in terms of if you couple that with finance. Now, I was looking at it, for example, I think an example of Dubai. We had floods that occurred in Dubai, but within a month, they were able to recover in terms of the infrastructure damage that were there. You could actually not be able to see, particularly you look at the airport that was actually flooded. But if you were to visit Dubai airport after a week, I think the only backlog that you'd see was for some of the bags that were lost because of the jamming of the system. But so we need definitely climate finance to assist us in terms of putting in place measures. But some of these measures can also be in terms of building resilient societies. What we have not seen is, we understand, particularly if you look at areas such as Durban, we have got a lot of populations that are on steep slopes. And when you have got a lot of rainfall that has actually taken place, this rainfall tend to result in landslides, which are the culprits in terms of some of the fatalities that we have seen. So we need also to start to see the government removing or migrating some of the people from some of the dangerous areas. We have got a lot of informal settlement, particularly in South Africa. We have got a huge problem of people that are in informal settlement. And most of these people are actually located in areas that we know, even when we look at our disaster risk mapping in terms of our urban areas, we know those people are actually vulnerable to floods. But what we have not seen is actually a commitment in terms of moving those people to safer environments because of also the backlog in terms of accommodation, but also in terms of the budget allocation. We have seen a lot of budget cuts that has not only affected the human settlement, but all other relevant, all other departments from a government perspective. So that climate finance become important, but will also require funding in terms of not only climate change adaptation and resilience building, but we also need financing for just energy transition, which will also ensure that we are at pace in terms of reducing our carbon emissions. Because what we are seeing is over the last year, if you look at the greenhouse gas emissions, they've actually been an exponential growth, which is actually concerning, because what we then now know is that the more amount of carbon emissions that we have, the higher the likelihood that we are going to experience even worse sort of climate change scenarios in the future.
The KZN Premier Tami Ntuli, has said a number of things. He's said that land should be assessed before being assigned as residential areas. That seems like an obvious measure to me. If it isn't already in place, that's incredibly worrying. But he's also said that people must heed weather warnings. And to some extent, yes, that is true. We need to be careful of crossing bodies of water that are moving. We don't know what's beneath the surface. But in the case of my home collapsing in on me, there's not much I can do in that case insofar as weather warnings are concerned.
Yes, so it is one thing to issue out weather warnings, and I want to compliment, I think, our SOARs and other weather agencies that have been playing a critical role. But I think in many respects, a common person does not always understand, or some of this information that we're talking about does not always reach the intended user. Perhaps maybe with the same kind of meaning and understanding that it deserves. So the onus still lies upon the our local authorities to ensure that if there is a weather warning, people actually take heed by taking a drastic effort to actually evacuate, particularly people that we ordinarily know that these people are going to be in risk areas. It's not adequate for a person who is in an informal settlement to tell them that there's a flood that is coming without providing that same individual an alternative accommodation where they can actually put up. So these people find themselves in these situations. If you look at the informal settlement, so the issue of urban planning, in most urban settlements in South Africa, particularly those that result from informal settlements, we actually move in as government to actually put infrastructure where there is already a settlement. So some of these, I think, are driven by our politics, because sometimes politicians do encourage people to go and stay, even in areas that they know that these areas are flood risk. So there is more that is needed from just issuing out warnings. We need to actually see the disaster management teams going door to door and ensuring that people are evacuated, particularly in those vulnerable and hotspot areas.
No, absolutely. Let me thank you for your time, Prof. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Professor Kaitano Dube is with the Vaal University of Technology as we continue to unpack the flooding that's hit parts of KwaZulu-Natal. In fact, let's stay with the story.